What inspired this event for me is the current attacks, lies, and policies perpetrated on the people trying to cross our southern border over the past couple of years. The accusations that they are invading us, that they are criminals, these are lies. But they are said over and over again by people in power, so in the echo chamber that covers our political leaders, these lies get resonance, and that gives them a kind of legitimacy for many Americans. We are vulnerable to such discourse because so many of us know so little about our southern neighbors of Central America, their history, and the effects of our policies on their communities and their people. Today we will speak of El Salvador and Nicaragua, but we can certainly add Guatemala and Honduras to that list. But what is the story behind the story? Why do people and families flee their homelands, travel 2,000 miles, take on such a dangerous journey, and in fact subject themselves to great risk? It is true that many Central Americans have crossed our borders over decades and are now a vital part of our society. It is also true that our country for over a century has crossed their borders and landed on their communities with devastating consequences, often in helicopters with guns and massive military funding supporting repressive and brutal regimes. Regimes that have engaged in gross human rights violations, to damage their communities, to their attempts to build their own civil institutions, to take control over their destinies has been staggering. The U.S. policy towards Central America has been extractive of wealth, at times supportive of unspeakable brutality, and often lied about over and over again. So much so that the most recent lies just cannot stand. Not in the interest of ideology or politics, but in the interest of humanity. The people. All three of these speakers today have spent their careers working in the interest of the people, often the poorest and most vulnerable people. People like Rufina Amaya, the lone survivor of the El Mozote Massacre perpetrated by a U.S.-trained funded battalion of El Salvadorian soldiers. She survived 2 days of the worst possible atrocity anyone in this room can imagine. And as a graduate student back in the early 80s, I remember so vividly of another American administration lying about these events occurring in Central America. Today we speak of El Salvador and Nicaragua specifically, and people like Rufina, who were invisible to the American public. They were disposable peasants when it came to our government and our public. But not to Susan and not to Mercedes, who both used their creative talents, their educational training, and their courage to expose the truth of human rights violations in El Mozote and to too many other places around the world to mention right now. They, as young people, students and graduates like you, made a decision to follow that path of documenting history, finding the evidence, setting the record straight. Today they are giants in their fields, a photo documentarian and forensic anthropology, and I am so humbled to be introducing them. And Julio is a young man who has made that decision as well. Another generation's fight for control of their destiny against the government in Nicaragua that today is repressing their desire for a greater voice, a greater democracy, and a fair share of the resources of their country. He stands with his brothers and sisters against the brutality escalating since last April that has led to hundreds of people jailed and killed. This has all been cited by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and continues right up to this weekend, a report that Mercedes' organization, the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, contributed. Short context now to the El Salvador story. This is one of the worst moments in a decade of horrific atrocities, the El Mozote. That is now known as El Salvadorian Civil War. Beginning with the coup in 1979 and after years of brutal crackdowns by government forces on those who sought reforms of the government, an armed struggle began between a coalition of rebel groups which came to be known as the FMLN and the U.S.-backed government of El Salvador, principally controlled by its military. The war led to 75,000 deaths in the 1980s, 85% of which were at the hands of the government, army, paramilitary, and death squads, according to the UN Truth Commission. The U.S. funded that military to the tune of $3.7 billion in the 1980s. That's over $1 million a day. And trained its officers in the name of preventing communism taking hold in Central America. In 1980, death squads killed Archbishop Oscar Romero while he was giving a mass and calling for an end to the killing. In that same year, the National Guard raped and killed 3 Catholic nuns and a Catholic lay worker. President Reagan's administration blamed the nuns for their own murder. Foreign policy advisor Jean Kirkpatrick told a reporter, the nuns were not just nuns, the nuns were political activists. After this event, further funding of the El Salvadorian Army required certification on progress towards human rights by the administration and Congress. It is in this context that in December of 1981, a U.S. trained battalion of El Salvadorian military landed in Morazan, a rural region of El Salvador near the Honduran border, and engaged in the scorched earth tactics of attacking populations of villages and hamlets to clear the region of so-called rebel sympathizers. On December 11th, they entered El Mozote, and according to the latest records, killed between 900 and 1,000 villagers, men, women, and children, over 500 children. A village known to be made up of evangelicals who were anti-communist. Susan was among the first 3 individuals to get to the village, along with 2 reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post. She traveled through extremely dangerous territory to get to the village. A village that at the time, our own government officials were too afraid to make the trip to investigate what happened. She took the pictures that were sent to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The story that ran on their front pages 2 days before recertification of human rights progress in El Salvador was to be approved. The story ignored and covered by the administration, accusing reporters as rebel sympathizers by none other than Elliot Abrams, the new appointee of the Trump administration as liaison for democracy in Venezuela. From here, Susan picks up the story. Mercedes continues that story in the 1990s as she and her team were members of the UN Truth Commission on Human Rights in El Salvador that investigated crimes against humanity in that war, and who just last year finally got to testify in a trial against the officers involved in the massacre. They have documented the evidence, and both their stories have been subjected to lies. Lies by our government and the El Salvadorian government. But time has proven them correct and exposed those lies. From there, we turn to the current crisis in Nicaragua, where more brutality faces those people who seek to build a better society. People like Rufina, people like you, students, people like the families who are now fleeing to our borders. So without further ado, Susan Meiselas.
Can't say no to Tom, right? What kind of passion. You guys are so lucky to have someone that speaks so much. It really moves me a lot. Because I think the hardest thing is to come back from these places and to remember how important it is to reach out to people like you who will be the next generation. So I have to also really thank Julio, because coming right from the belly of the beast in Nicaragua meant a lot to me. That the show that you'll see in the gallery has eyes from Nicaragua as part of my installation, curated with them. And Mimi, with whom we've done a lot of work in El Salvador, is part of our history, not all of our history. And not knowing who of you would come. So I have to thank all of you for taking the time from all the places that you should be and hopefully staying with us. I wanted this to be a little bit kind of from a place where you could imagine yourselves. So I'm going to be brief. I'm not going to focus on Nicaragua, which you can see in the gallery, and there are other stories that lead to what Nicaragua was in this period of time. It's a parallel history, and it's not possible to tell it all and also have the rich conversation we're hoping for. So I'm only focusing on El Salvador, but I want you to imagine someone who is not that different than you. As a young American, white, privileged, not having ever been to Central America, not speaking Spanish because I learned French, going to a place that progressively evolves into a popular insurrection. And that was Nicaragua, June 78. Within a very short time, El Salvador expresses itself in a different kind of conflict, very similar, different construct. You have to imagine the U.S. military, as Thomas has mentioned, was present in different ways. I mean, the U.S. had supported the Somoza family for 50 years in Nicaragua. So I had a construct to understand, but I had never had my feet on the ground. The first work in El Salvador is focused on the killing of local priests, which was becoming prevalent in the spring of '79. You have to imagine that the priests are the closest to the poor. They live in those communities. They work with those communities. They call them comunidades de base. So the organization in these communities began began there, and the priests were the first to suffer. I mean, but long before Romero, there was the killing of the local priests. So my first entry to Salvador was to understand that dynamic. This is honoring Rutilio Grande in a small town called Adelares. So I just want to bring you into when I'm landing, I don't know the full context. When you're making photographs, you're just capturing moments. They fit together over time. I'm also moving around because there's no one single focal point. There's no one perspective. It's multiple perspectives. And only through moving through a place can you begin to see the dynamics. So these peasants on the main road to La Libertad, the tanks were everywhere just watching. Think of your own community. What it would feel, how it would be different if we had tanks on the streets watching. And we know the places that's happened. But no marches, just in the public sector. Or imagine that you're working in such a way that you're hoping by being there, by being present, you will protect these people just for the moment that you're there. You can't protect them going forward. They obviously were interrogated. This was part of a small barrio around San Salvador. The accusations, you know, the intimidation, this is some of what Julio knows very well that's happening in Nicaragua today. But there are other moments that are also incredible and astounding, that people still get married. They still go on in their lives with this all happening around them. And you can't even imagine that. So as a young documentarian, part of it was bringing this work back, trying to get Americans to have some sense of what was happening in a very faraway place. So this is the New York Times spread, and I'm pointing it out because I want you to think, as critical readers of images in the world, be it on the internet today or in print, just how hard it is to compete for the space, you know, because there's so much consumerism dominating all of our interactions. So are you buying a Chrysler, or you're trying to make sense of what does it mean that these two teenagers have their thumbs tied together and are killed in the middle of their neighborhood? Or you hope for the exposure, and I say hope for because it's never a guarantee when you make the photographs that they will live in other worlds. The fact that the New Republic then used the photograph of La Mano Blanca to announce the death squads and the implication of and the relationship of the death squads to a number of things that were happening in El Salvador at that time. Mano Blanca, the white hand, was left on the door of a peasant organizer. He was assassinated soon after. So when you go, you don't know what you're going to find. It's a very important thing that you don't have a guarantee, but you have to commit to the process. Tom just mentioned the Maryknoll nuns. We had heard about the Maryknoll nuns. They had come into the airport. In fact, the Ambassador White had had dinner with two of them several nights before, and they didn't arrive where they were supposed to go. And so the mystery was what had happened to the bus, the VW bus, going from the airport. It wasn't that long a stretch to San Salvador. John Hoagland, who was working at the time for the AP, and I found the nuns at the back going through many rural paths. No indicators until we came to a campesino who said, yeah, we were forced to bury 4 white women in the back of that field. And then Ambassador White came, and then the journalists came. We were the scouts, we were the detectives. And think about that word when you think about meaning. What does it mean to be the detective? What do you have? What do you find? How do you ask the right questions that leads you? Obviously, the campesinos were terrified to tell us they themselves had buried these nuns, and yes, they had seen that they'd been raped. So you make the photograph. Making the photograph, and I'm going to switch to Mozote, because even with what you heard from Tom, when you hear about something happening, you don't necessarily know what you'll find of what people say has happened, and that's a very important construct. If you think about the difference of seeing the evidence versus hearing a story about something that happened to someone. So we had heard via the Radio Venceremos, which was the FMLN radio, that there had been the Mozote Massacre. And as Tom reported to you, the U.S. State Department, they did send a delegation. They never quite got to the place that was the source of what, the core center of the massacre. And Ray Bonner and Alma Guillermo and I crossed from Honduras, crossed the border into the northern part of El Salvador, and the first things we saw were the destroyed homes. So it was very evident something had happened. We didn't know what had happened. So we weren't reading, as you are, reading and hearing from Tom what had been outlined. We were just trying to make sense of what had happened. And when you see burned houses with ceramic tiles, part of what happens is those tiles fall, bodies are burned, and so it's very difficult to detect the scale of what had happened. Or you go to the outlying part of the village, and you see bodies that are still intact because we were there within 2 weeks of this happening. But you still don't have a sense of the scale. So when these pictures went back up to Washington, D.C., they couldn't prove anything. And I think that's very important, and Mimi's going to pick up the trail of proof and evidence and the depth of evidence you need to really be able to prove. What I wanted to, I'm going back to what you just saw with Tom, Rufina Amaya. Amaya is tremendously important to both Ray, Alma, and I, because she, sitting in that field, was the only survivor who could count and name the people in the village who had been killed and who were missing. And so she reported to us nearly 1,000 victims of the Mozote. I think it was 800. Mimi would know the exact number at that moment. And yes, Elliot Abrams denied to the committee that was judging whether or not the military aid should be stopped. It appears to be an incident that is at least being significantly misused at the very best by the guerrillas. That was the public statement. So I want you to think about that, because when you hear Mimi's team and what it took to document a massacre that a sole survivor had witnessed, and how traumatizing it must have been for her to tell us, and that we told all of you, the front page of the New York Times, Washington Post, it doesn't get better than that. I had been to the Abalcot training, which is the U.S. military training site, was principally in the School of Americas, but the Abalcot Battalion, this was their target practice. So how do you make pictures speak to history unfold? I look at this history and think about how 10 years later or 12 years later, Mimi corrected me the other night, a small memorial is built. There still aren't the conditions for her team to come in and document from the graves. And ultimately, the story she's going to tell you is how the bones, exhuming the bones, among other things, are what told the story and proved. So this notion of proof, in contrast to a sense of necessity to witness and to document. And hopefully we'll build off of that today. Mimi.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you all of you that are here. Susan thought it was important to say just a few words about how we started, and then go to El Salvador and to Nicaragua. So the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team that I'm a co-founder started in 1984 as democracy returned to our country after 8 years of military government. This was, I see these images now and it feels it's another world, right? But these were the members of the military junta that ruled Argentina. Been a few changes over the years, but it was during 8 years. And as some of you may know, at least 10,000 people disappeared in the hands of the state. And when democracy returned, trials started, and the demand of families to recover the remains of their loved ones, or to know what happened to them, started as well. We were students at the time, ending our, about to be graduated. And it was the first time that someone was asking us to use our knowledge to actually work on human rights. I mean, we had participated as citizens, if you'd like, on many demonstrations that had happened at the end of the dictatorship and at the beginning, but when a U.S. delegation of forensic experts came to Argentina at the request of, at the time, a Truth Commission and a number of families of victims organizations, they were asking for anthropologists and archaeologists to look on a number of places where they thought the remains of disappeared people may be, to start uncovering them, analyzing them, and eventually trying to identify them. And that's how we started in 1984. As a non-profit, non-governmental organization dedicated to the application of forensic sciences, originally forensic anthropology mostly, but then it ended up being a much wider multidisciplinarity. We did not think at the time, when we started this work, that we were going to become an organization that was going to work internationally and then it was going to grow and so on. The only thing we thought at the time, I think it's probably part of Julio personal history as well, is just, well, something is happening in our country and we need to do something, and they're asking us to do something from our well, we can use our profession, and that was it. And then we'll work on that for a few years. There's trials going on. There's at least evidence that needs to be put on this trial. There's families waiting for an answer. And then we will go back to academia. Most of us never went back. But just to say that, sometimes you do things and you never know exactly where they may lead you. Two problems we faced when we started this work. One was a technical one. There was the forensic services there were not used to exhume skeletal remains, because by the time we found them, they have become skeletonized, and so it's more complicated to exhume them, and they were often buried in mass graves. So the local forensic services did not have the capacity to exhume complicated mass graves, and we also didn't have the practice of extracting information when you only have bones. They were typically more used to deal with complete bodies. And the second problem was the problem of trust, which is, since the forensic services in Argentina are state institutions, families of the victims did not trust them to do this type of work. And these two principles are what we've been finding, in almost every country where we work. So originally we were supposed to be a government forensic team operating on this, but as we also found in many other countries, the political agenda of the government related to human rights changed after, Argentina changed after a number of military uprisings that occurred as the trials were starting. And so the idea of having a governmental team conducting these exhumations was no longer of interest to the government. So we became a non-governmental organization. With this multidisciplinary approach that I was mentioning before, and with the idea also to try to create local capacity. Being very clear that what we could do is it's minimal, or it's just one part, and what we need to do is to strengthen local forensic services so that they can do this type of work. And we, from the beginning, made our focus the families of the victims. It's a long story of why we did that eventually we can discuss it. But I guess we see a very different, a big difference when you work on human rights cases and when you work on normal criminal cases. And talking with U.S. forensic people here, sometimes they will say, well, why are you so, so talking all the time with the families and being, have the families everywhere and so on. Where are you, social workers, or are you, scientists doing this work? And we understand that, on criminal cases, here, the family members may be among the first suspects on a homicide case, but that's not the case on human rights cases in the majority of them. And there is the trust has been completely broken between whoever is providing justice or collecting evidence and the families, and you need to build that again. And you do that partly, we think, by working with them, being completely transparent with them, and providing access to everything that you do, right? So after we continue to work on cases from Argentina, but these are less the countries that we have worked up until today. Getting directly into the Mozote case, we were originally, as Susan was mentioning, the massacre happened in December 1981. It was reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post very soon. I mean, we normally don't have that kind of evidence, frankly, of a massacre so soon and so direct as what Susan, Raymond, and Alma Guillermo Prieto collected at the time. In 1981, some of the survivors from this massacre returned, in 1989 actually, returned from refugee camps in Honduras, crossed the border, and started demanding the local officials to investigate the massacre. And in 1981, we received a call from Tutela Legal, which was the legal office of the Archbishop of San Salvador at the time, and from the Comunidades de Base, what Susan was mentioning before, these church groups from the Catholic Church, very inspired by the liberation theology and so on, that have been operating on these communities, were coming back from Honduras and wanted this to be investigated. We went there, the war was almost ending, but it was still, the peace agreements were still not there, and we could not find a way of starting the investigation. We had to wait until the war was officially over in 1992, and after a lot of pressure from the families and from these communities that did a lot of different actions, demonstrations, and so on, we were finally named as expert witnesses on the case that had been opened on a very small town, San Francisco Botera, in the north of Morazan, where there was a judge that was terrified about having to investigate the largest massacre of the Civil War. And he named us, but he said, I can't, we can't start exhumations, because it's the Supreme Court's not going to approve it, and even though I can do it by myself, I'm not going to do it. So we have to wait until October '92, when there was a UN, United Nations Truth Commission, who was set in place as part of the peace agreements, and then we were named as their technical consultants as well. And this commission had the rare capacity to order exhumations. So they said, well, whether the government, the Salvadoran government wants it or not, we're going to start exhumations, and that's how it was done. Then there were a number of interactions, and this is why I put this chronology of the case, because it shows, it's partly what Susan was saying. You never know when you start doing these cases, how long it's going to take to actually reach your day in court. You have no idea if your evidence is going to be used or not. Even if you may have the strongest evidence, as it was in this case, and it may not be used, because it depends on a number of political things that are beyond your control. So, after we did Site 1, that I'll talk about a little bit more, and the UN Truth Commission report was released in March 1993, immediately after that, a week after that, the Salvadorian Parliament passed an amnesty law. And like other places, this amnesty law was also forbidding to start to continue any kind of exhumations. So for a number of years, we could not even recover the remains as part of for identification purposes, or to give them back to the families, or to provide them with a proper burial. Since 1993 up until 99, then we couldn't do anything, and in 2000 we were allowed to return to El Salvador and continue with the exhumations. And then finally last year, how many years have passed? I guess like 37 years after the massacre occurred, finally we were able to testify in a small courtroom in San Francisco Botera, in the north of Morazan, where finally the families, the survivors, the families of victims, the survivors, ourselves, many other people were able to have their day in court and explain what the evidence was about. This was not a gigantic trial. This was not the International Criminal Tribunal or something like that. This was a judge with the support of the lawyers from the families and from the support of the communities that decided that there was a reinterpretation of the amnesty law, and he decided to take it and to go forward. How long it's going to last, we still don't know. Yeah. So one of the first things we did when we started to investigate the massacre, was collecting all the information that was available to us. And among that, of course, was, Susan's photographs. I didn't know Susan at the time. Actually, we met precisely because we were both investigating the same massacre with a difference of 10 years in between. So we asked for her photographs and the testimonies of Raymond Bonner and Alma Guillermo Prieto. And then we interviewed for several months all the families of the victims, trying to put together a list, or checking the list that others had been actually started, and collecting physical information of the victims. Where were they? When the massacre happened? Where do the families think they were buried, and so on. In this massacre, the main thing was not to try to identify the remains of their loved ones. You have to understand, or maybe just to explain that when this happened, the reason why the majority of the victims of that list are women and children and old people is because, in the words of their relatives that survived, they did not expect the army to, when it was announced that there was a military operation going there, they did not expect to touch the women and children. This was new to them, and so when they heard that the military were coming, the Atlacat battalion and so on was coming to their hamlets, the men withdrew to the hills and to the mountains there, and the women and the children stayed in the hamlets. So after the army left the area, after a week or two of being there and have burned the hamlets, killed their people and burned their fields and killed their animals, the majority of the husbands went back and started burying the remains of their wives and their kids and their parents and so on. So most of them did not have a doubt, that the relatives were killed and where they were killed and how they were killed, but they wanted the massacre to be proved. They wanted the massacre to be investigated. So our main question to solve, or to try to provide evidence, was this a massacre or was a shootout, which was the two versions that existed at the time. These are just very briefly, the result of a number of years of work conducting exhumations on the 6 hamlets that were affected by the massacre of Mozote. It took the name of Mozote because that's where the largest number of victims were, but it actually affected another 5 hamlets as well that were nearby. You see the total number there of 282 as a minimum number of individuals that were recovered from different houses, graves, and primary and secondary graves in these 6 hamlets. Yes, the number of victims was way higher than that, but when you investigate a massacre of this sort, it's very hard to recover all the remains, particularly if you work 10 or more years after it happened. And we can explain it at a later point. But this division in this slide that you see by age and sex, it's showing partly what we were saying, right? If you look at the first row there, 74% of the remains that were recovered belonged to children that were between 0 and 12 years of age. So what the testimonies were saying was kind of consistent with what we were finding. And just to have a brief idea of the investigation, I'd like to comment on what we call Site 1, which was the first one that we actually exhumed in El Mozote, which is what you see there. It's an old photograph. This was supposed to be the place where, according to Rufina, partly, she thought that maybe the men were in this particular place. And we were very nervous about exhuming this place because we knew that the government was insisting we had to start by this place, and we knew that that would kind of fit their narrative of, okay, we're just going to find guerrilla people there that were fighting against the army and so on and so forth, and that they would, strong their view of the events. To our surprise, it was actually the place where the children were killed or laid inside. So on that small place, this is just a reconstruction because there was so much vegetation when we arrived, you couldn't see much. It was called the Convent because it was next to the church. So that's a little bit of a reconstruction of the place. that's when we started working, we also had to be with all the forensic service of El Salvador that was rotating there for 2 months. We found on that site 143 individuals, just a small room, from which 136 were children under 12, and there were 7 adults, among which was a pregnant woman. That's just showing, the stone wall around the convent. This is pretty small, and just how we were working on the place. And each of the circles that you see there, it shows the location of a skull. So, each of the individuals that we were finding, we were just taking tridimensional measurements of its location and putting it there. So you see that there's a concentration of them, particularly on the area close to that door and a little bit towards one side of the convent. We found also a very large number of ballistic evidence here. We find approximately 250 cartridge cases and 260-something fragments of bullets that were either embedded on the clothing or on the remains directly, or on holes on the floor, or on the internal walls of the convent. We did not find anything on the external wall, which was quite interesting in terms of if this was a shootout, you would expect to find also bullets on the outside of it. And you see in those dots that you may not see that clearly, but part of them are fragments of bullets, and part of them are cartridge cases. The distribution of the cartridge cases was different from the one of the fragments of bullets. The one from fragments of bullets coincides with the majority of the location of the remains, while the one from the cartridge cases was more towards another part, more towards the outside, where there was a window there. So if you are familiar with some of the, how normally it happens when you shoot a weapon, is that the cartridge case, it comes to the right, and the bullet goes, into its target to the front. So the location of the cartridge cases could give us an idea of the possible location of the shooters actually when they were shooting. We also find 2 explosive artifacts that also produce an enormous amount of damage on the remains. But interesting enough on the ballistic evidence, we found information that could be interesting in terms of who the perpetrators may be. We know that people, different testimonies and so on, were pointing to the Atlacat battalion and a number of other evidence as well. But what was interesting on the ballistic evidence was that in a very large number of the cartridge cases, on the back of it, there is a stamp that says LC for Lake City, Missouri, which is the manufacturer of that kind of ballistic evidence that at that time was a major provider of the US government in terms of its ammunition. So that was something supporting the knowledge that the US was the one training this battalion and providing them with ammunition. At that time of the war also, the the caliber that the cartridge cases were showing and the fragments of bullets was, to begin with, consistent one with the other one, but also it was pointing to the use of an M16 rifle that at that time, particularly in the war, was solely used by the Atlacat battalion. So all this put together was a strong point of evidence to who can have been the perpetrators of this. If this would have been more of a shootout, we would expect to find all kind of different ammunition there from different sources, different calibers, different potential weapons and so on, and different manufacturers for sure. Yeah. All right. Then dating the event was another issue that we always try to do. Now, when you're dealing with events that are so close, or that allegedly happened so close, when you're investigating, you cannot use carbon-14 or other methods where you use, that you could use on other cases. Here, you will mostly use, aside from testimonies, which of course are very important, other indirect things that may provide you with a date. Again, the cartridge cases was providing us with potential date because on the back of them, they have also the year in this case, not always, but in this case, the year in which they were manufactured. But we could see from 184, we could see that in 172 were manufactured in 1978. And then the oldest was from 1973, 74, 75, only 10, and the newest from 1981. That is, there were no cartridge cases that were beyond the date of the massacre, right? And the coins can sometimes provide the same thing as well, because they do have a date of manufacture. So we recovered 33 coins, and you see there the dates of manufacture from 1952 until 1977. So we were collecting all this evidence, but there was no, and we were providing this evidence to a court, but there was no, as it happens, it happened in Argentina for many years, and in other places, nobody was going to jail, or there was just reports that were inside of our file. But at the same time, it was providing the families with the possibility to recover the remains in the proper way and have a ceremony which they were waiting for many, many years to have. What you see on that photograph is Rufina Amaya many years later on the front of that photograph looking at the coffins there that contains the remains of the people that we found on the different hamlets. And finally, this is the photo of the court in the San Francisco Botera as it looks when we had to testify and when a lot of the families and the survivors and so on testified so far. So you see, it's not a gigantic place or anything like that, but it's a place where, you know, I don't know, what was it, an attempt to justice. So I think I would give it like there for El Salvador, and then maybe we come back afterwards for Nicaragua. Yes. Do you want to show the
website?
Yeah, maybe one. Yeah, I mean, and then we're going to move to Nicaragua, which is a completely different setup. It's very complicated. Julio's going to explain it now, but as some of you may know, since April 18, 2018, a number of demonstrations started to happen in Nicaragua, and the repression to those demonstrations was very, very strong from the government, resulting on hundreds of people killed and wounded and so on. So investigating urban spaces that become a crime scene, for us as transit people, it's very complicated. You have a lot of people running, forces here and there. It's very confusing. It's very complicated at first. So there was a special commission of inquiry set up by the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. It was called the Independent Group of Experts, or HIE, Nicaragua, that was sent to Nicaragua to try to investigate at least one period of this violence and try to establish if there were human rights violations and try to support the local judiciary, that was the idea at the beginning, in their investigation and prosecution of these crimes. The mandate was April 18, 2018 until May 30th, 2018. We know that there were many other violations that happened afterwards, but that was their mandate. And they have 6 months to investigate this. They contacted us in September, more or less, 2018, and said, well, we have, in this case, the government had not provided any documents other than some autopsy reports that were given to the Inter-American Commission on a previous date, before the HIE was started. They said, so we have interviews with witnesses, and what we have is thousands of videos taken by people, mostly on their phones, you know, as part of their demonstrations. And I said, well, what can you do? And we're like, okay, let's just start thinking about this. We were lucky that we had a previous experience working as expert witnesses for the Ayotzinapa case, where the 43 students in Mexico that disappeared in 2014. We worked with forensic architecture firm in London that does digital platforms, again, for trying to see how putting things in time and space can help us as an investigative tool and as a communication tool about what happened. So we partnered this time with C2, which is another architecture firm in Brooklyn, here in New York, that they have also done similar constructions and reconstructions of urban crime scenes like that in Eastern Europe and other places as well. So they said, well, the first thing that we have so little time, we have only 2 months to do this because the mandate was of the commission was ending at the end of December. What can we do with that? So the first thing they said is, let's just do a visual archive. Just select, they told the HIE and ourselves, select 4 events, and we're going to do a visual archive with a timeline. This at least can help anybody that would like to, as a first step of an investigation. For me, if I get to a case and I have something like this, it's an enormous advantage. So what we did working with HIE, C2 and ourselves was put together all these hundreds of videos for those 4 events on a timeline and available to everybody. So essentially, the platform has that. You click on and it's public for anybody that want to see it. On one of the sites, you can go to any of these 4 events, and then you can, there's a timeline and graphics also explain a little bit how, maps and so on explain you how the demonstrators and the different forces were clashing and so on, and a timeline where you could see the different videos. And then we had a reconstruction of one of them.
I just said, these are the events.
Yes, okay.
Click on any of these events, or you can scroll down here. When you click on the events, you'll see the actual street video, paramilitary types and beating on the demonstrators, trying to break up the demonstrations, right? As well as demonstrate,
Exactly.
See,
and it's on the and Susan
it's in the
exhibition,
gallery.
you can see it. Yeah.
You can all use it in the gallery if you like.
Yeah.
From Julio.
Yeah, and this is an excellent tool that we realize it's becoming more and more complicated to deal with hundreds and thousands of pages and volumes of files and so on. We need, instruments that we can help us to investigate better, to put our information there, and also to convey to the general public, in a much more shorter and simple way, exactly what we think may happen. So I can leave it there. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to say I'm honored to be here with you guys at SUNY, and thank you so much, Tom, for the invitation. And kind of a little mention about Susan and Mercedes. One, for those of us who didn't live the 1979 insurrection, young people, including the ones who have been protesting, when we try to imagine what happened in 1979, odds are we're remembering one of Susan's photos, actually. It's been a huge contribution to the collective memory. Was automatic consolidation of all the powers of the state. Okay, so it means the first thing you do is that you start working to consolidate the judiciary, the parliament, the electoral system, and of course the executive. Whereas before there was some sort of checks and balances, immediately they started getting rid of them. In 2008 was the first time in about 30 years that international observers were denied access to the country, and there was widespread fraud. This was, you saw ballot boxes showing up in garbage heaps. It was just outrageous. There were widespread protests, but there was no recount, no anything. That was the first kind of big sign that something huge was changing. During that time as well, there was a huge kind of push against social movements. A lot of people started coming out. Say, for instance, people that started coming out and said that they wanted free elections, but people that protested essentially were met with the police. When there was a new canal that was passed for a canal to go through Nicaragua, that was done without consultation of any of the indigenous communities that lived in that area. It was done without consultation to people that owned those lands. There was massive protests through all the affected areas. And this was illegal, by the way, because it was going through a huge area that was autonomous. It belonged to the Afro and indigenous communities of the Caribbean coast, which by law have access to those lands. But they were not consulted when the law came out that said that the canal would be built. So when they went out and protested, the peasant movement and say the Afro movement from the Caribbean coast, it was usually the same. There were 98 protests, and to each one of these protests, the police would always be called. You would either have the police, or you would have counter-protests. Counter-protests have always been a huge part of kind of the way that you respond to social mobilization. In this case, as you can see, it's very green. That's because the caravan of, say, trucks was blocked within the municipality. People knew that they were organizing the protests, so they would send the police from Managua and from surrounding places to cut off the roads and send tear gas, send them all back. Sometimes they made it to Managua, but just on the outskirts. But normally they were met with violence. The message was always the same. If you protest, you will be met with violence. You don't have a right to do this. So now I'll kind of fast forward to what is the current situation now. On April 11th of last year, there was a huge forest fire in the Indio Maíz Natural Reserve. This is one of the largest natural reserves, and it started in different places at the same time. It seemed as though it was done on purpose because there is a huge expansion of, say, farmers going into the reserve so that they can bring in cattle. The students were the first ones to protest. They closed off the roads near the UCA, one of the main universities in Managua. The Nicaraguan rainforests have been decreasing for the past 20 years at an alarming rate. They were furious about it, and so they went out to the streets and demanding that there be a real response to the fire. There had been, say, offers of help from Costa Rica, with firefighters from Costa Rica, from other Central American countries, from Canada as well, and they were all rejected for some reason. And so people were pretty angry about the response. So it was actually university students starting on April 11th that are there, they're out of the streets, they're protesting, and the response to the protesters was the police. Was riot gear, all these, that right there is where they're in the process of, in a line, pushing the protesters out of the street, and essentially that's how that was responded to for several days. Eventually it started raining, and that helped stop the fire, so things calmed down a little bit. A few days after this, what happened was that the government passed a reform for Social Security. It said essentially from now on, the elderly will receive less, and the young have to pay more. Now, I'm sure anybody anywhere would react with a lot of suspicion to that, or a lot of anger, especially because they weren't receiving that much. A lot of people were receiving $70 a month, and they were being told they would be receiving 5% less. And what made people very angry about that was that we've been talking about Social Security for about 2 years. Everyone knew that administrative costs had multiplied during that time. There seems to be a lot of corruption inside of it. There was a huge amount of contracts that had been given out in a completely non-transparent way. So we knew that it was extremely mismanaged. So when they come from one day to the next without a previous consultation and say, from now on, things will be different where you guys have to pay more, then people got really angry and went out to the streets. They called for protests on April 18th in Managua and León. The response was the counter-protesters. So, this was a group of people that normally showed up in their motorcycles, never took off their helmets, and essentially went up to the protesters and started beating them up. Always with the idea that you really don't have a right to do this. The reporters weren't safe from this. Some of them were actually wearing, a group of about 40 were wearing the Sandinista youth t-shirt, one that at some point in the 80s, Sandinista youth was something that was respected. It was, ideological young people doing something. Now this is used by essentially what are gang members, whose only role right now is to beat up people and make sure that they understand what their role is. This is the head of an important NGO in Nicaragua who's protesting there with her signs. She was beat over the head. That's Ayana. She's a student out there protesting as well who got hit during that time. Essentially all of this, imagine kind of a huge difference between the 1980s and 70s is that all this was on Facebook Live. Like anybody who wasn't there was watching their friends getting beat up. And so you can imagine how you would feel if you're a 20-year-old and your friend went out there with a placard and they got beat up like this. So people got really angry, especially the students. So especially the first few days, it was mainly students moving forward and then other young people joining. On the 19th, kind of what would normally happen before is that they would beat people up, and it actually did work that after a few days it would kind of die down, people would kind of get the message, but something different happened this time. And each time they would come out and get beat up, the next day the crowd would multiply. So on the 19th it got much larger, they started going after different streets. It was the first attempt to take over one of the universities in protest. Essentially, the students taking over the streets wherever they could. They went to the Agrarian University. This is the National Engineering University. So the UCO had been a private one, but now this is completely huge, public and private universities, essentially taking the streets, demanding an end to the repression, as well as a reversal of Social Security reforms. When you go see Susan's exposition, oftentimes people will compare this photo to one of the ones, a famous one that she took from 1979. You'll see which one. But essentially, the students were going out were setting up barricades. Something that makes kind of protesting very easy in Nicaragua is that you have these blocks that are the streets. Many of the streets are made out of these blocks that you can kind of like just pick up. You can like pick them up and make into a wall. And that was essential. That block was actually the symbol of the insurrection in 1979, and it was essential for this one as well. So they set up roadblocks at the universities and started taking over the universities. And on the 19th, the government was shooting rubber bullets. They were shooting gas canisters, and the first people died on the 19th. On the 20th, 20 people were killed. I don't remember if it was 20 or 22. But by that point is when the movement turned into not just young people calling for reforms. That's when you start calling for the president's ousting. And the protests just grow and grow. By the end of the first weekend, about day 5, you had about 40 killed. And this is not a kind of, this won't be able to show you kind of all of the details, but this just kept on increasing. Because it was the students, and this is kind of the analysis that we have kind of afterward, but it was mainly because it was students who were generally considered to have a moral authority that many other actors in society might not have. You know, you might question whether if the political party is protesting, well, you know, they have interest and all this. If this certain group of an area is protesting, well, you know what's behind that. When the students are protesting, a lot of people paying attention. There's a certain sense that they're not there for money. They're not there. Because they're for a job. They're there because they're really angry about what's happening in society, and that moves a lot of other people. And so, essentially, from the present movement that I had mentioned before started speaking out and said, "Hey, if you don't stop shooting at the students, if you don't stop shooting at the young people, we're gonna block everything. We're gonna set up roadblocks." So within 2 weeks, the peasant movement nationwide had coordinated 170 roadblocks. They had completely halted the national economy. And people in every neighborhood in the major cities were setting up barricades. So about 700 barricades were set up in all the major neighborhoods so that the police couldn't come in. Meanwhile, the police and the paramilitaries, which are essentially people that are hooded and go around with AK-47s, who also work for the government, but not with police uniform, we're taking them down, and the shootings continue. The shootings never stopped. This is one of the first people that was killed on April 20th. Álvaro Conrado, a 15-year-old, who had showed up at the National University because he had some friends that were in college. He was in high school, and he said that he wanted to go bring them water. So he had his backpack on with little bags of water, and he was like running in between spaces to hand his friends water. And in the middle of that, he received a shot from above to the neck, actually. And the forensic report said that it was probably a sniper. So this is not very. It was using snipers. It was using very high artillery stuff. It was essentially the state seeing young people in social movement as potential army of whatever you want to call it. So his face became a symbol for many other people. That's his father. His father fought in the Sandinista revolution. He's a Sandinista all his life, as well as his mom. Marches continued. What began as kind of roadblocks kind of was complemented by marches, multitudinal marches, up to 500,000 people, the largest marches that had been seen in Nicaragua since for many years, probably in its history. It included, the mothers of all the killed started organizing as well, started forming the Mothers of April movement. This is only a few weeks after everything started, and you already have that long list of names. And the people holding it are normally family members of those killed. Sometime in June, this woman's house was burned down, and all this was on social media. And we were seeing as all this happened, as this house was going up in flames. 2 small children died. And just to kind of give you an idea of how these barricades looked. Maybe some complimentary kind of, say, aspects of this that I might have missed. When the students went out, they took over many universities. I know this used to happen more often in the States as well. Students say, something's not fair, everything has to stop until it's fair, right? Happens less now nowadays, but I was just talking to Tom and the rest of the group, but essentially they would take it over, and immediately the rest of the community everybody would set up kind of caravans to go drop off supplies. The students never were missing a single meal because people would not ever stop bringing them supplies. Everybody was with them. And now say in numbers, so up until August, it was about 325 people killed, over 1,400 wounded, over 80,000 are living in exile now. There's 802 political prisoners. The government was saying that this was essentially a right-wing coup financed by the CIA. They were saying that from the very beginning. And so they wanted to negotiate. So they said they were calling for negotiations for people to calm and kind of calm down and stop protesting. But they own most of the TV channels in the country, and so they can control this narrative. If there hadn't been social media, then one would probably only have these TV channels. But so one of the things that was called for in the protest was to have independent observers. That's why the International Commission on Human Rights was brought in as kind of a concession to the protesters. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was also brought in as a concession. And then other independent kind of human rights organizations came in, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, tons of others, and carried out their own independent reports. And that was essential. Without that, we'd still be talking about, the government saying that this is a right-wing coup, us saying that that's completely absurd. But because those exist, and because of the people that do that work and the reporters that you start talking now about, okay, well, now that that's more settled, then let's talk about the future and how you come out of this crisis. Something that also started playing a part is that because after the human rights kind of organizations came out, then the European Union started talking about possible sanctions, but only after close to a year. The U.S. Organization of American States was essentially started turning into kind of a multilateral pressure to force the government to stop the repression. So currently, what does it state right now? The 2 main, reporters in the country, the most respected reporters in the country, one is in jail in solitary confinement, along with his top reporters. Another one went to exile a few weeks ago, still reporting from there. All the major human rights organizations, some of them are in exile, and the other ones have been completely disbanded. They were declared illegal, and all their assets were taken away. Their buildings, all their computers, everything, all their files. And what you have now is a police state. You can't march. Marches were declared illegal in October of last year. So if you go out with a flag, you are picked up by the police, and then you're being told that you are inciting violence. And this is all under the framework of this anti-terrorism law, where terrorism is kind of the most broad definition you can probably think of. And after the economy is in shambles, it's expected to declined by 11% this year. It declined by 4% last year. And I guess, I don't know, maybe the kind of last thing, and I'll kind of open it up, is to think about this and how it relates to all the other kind of dictatorships that came before it, and kind of this kind of global trend as well. I mean, everything that I've seen lately says that there is a global trend towards autocracy, where people that have absolute power and they have access to lots of money systematically work to undo the institutions that prevent these kind of things from happening. And this was a 10-year process, maybe even before he was president, in which institutions were undermined, to the point where if you want to protest now it turns into a violent thing where no one can stop them because there is absolutely no balance of power. And that can happen absolutely anywhere, and it's happening worldwide. Yeah, if anybody wants to know anything more, if you have any more questions, and I can also talk about my movement, but I'd be happy to later on. Thank you very much.
So we have a little time, and you can ask some questions. I was supposed to ask some questions, but I think what I'm going to do is let you ask questions. So does anybody have a question they'd like to pose on any of the subjects? Go ahead.
Do you believe that, as for a lot of people who live in more developed countries, that we individuals have a duty when it comes to countries going through stuff like this? And if so, what can we do to help from miles away?
Yeah, sure.
In my view, absolutely, there's a duty to act. I mean, I think there's much more of a debate on what you do to act and what is acceptable and what is not. The first thing is to talk about it. I mean, if somebody, this is one large community where nobody's really independent. We're all kind of interacting with ways. If somebody that lives right next door to you is getting beat constantly by somebody in their family, you can either stay quiet and say that's not my business, or you can speak out about it, and maybe speaking out will make that person's life a little bit easier. In our case, it has. I mean, in our case, the movement is always nonviolent. There was always, and I can talk about the violence that did come out of it, where actually police officers were shot. There were like 22 police officers who died within out of the 325. So I think that's an important parenthesis that I had mentioned. But having people bear witness to atrocities is so important for relief, for other people believing you and just believing you is extremely important. And sometimes the people that are outside are actually helping the abuser in one way or another. And so if once you know about it, you can also search and find ways in which you might actually stop helping them if you are helping them. In the 1970s, the U.S. was financing the dictatorship directly. In this case, it's more like private sector and other people who might be supporting Ortega's companies that contribute to, to him being able to repress. So, absolutely. So what other things can be done? I think it depends on the situation, but yeah, definitely speaking out about it, saying that, not staying silent, making sure that as many people know, and especially people that have power, and that those people that, your representatives or people in government or in your institutions, for instance, for example, it's really symbolic for a university to speak out when other university students are being beaten. And that makes, those kind of things also make front page news in that country. And they provide huge amount of kind of moral support to those people. So, there's infinite ways of helping.
I would say one thing, to the extent that we ignore these things, we end up with lots of people fleeing for their lives on our border. And so we should understand that context, right? If we want to keep them, if they want to have a life with opportunity in their homeland, then we should create pressure to allow that to happen within their own institutions. Yeah, go ahead.
Susan, you were in Nicaragua when the Sandinistas took over, and Ortega was one of the leading people, and now he's landing. In 20 years, they can switch back again. I'm just wondering, when you witness revolutions, do you ever wonder if the long-term effect might be that is,
The long-term effect, the
that
long-term.
what you hope for today happens, and then it changes again in 10, 20 years.
Yeah, well, I think, that's part of, what I think Mimi and I were trying to give you a feeling for is that from the immediacy of the urgency, when you ask, how do you act? You act in the case of gathering documentation for witnessing is a very important specific act. So you have to understand there's a long chain and it's a long time. You don't always get the results you might hope for, but that doesn't prevent you from having your own moral compass, as I think Julio was saying, as to when you speak out or when you are sensitized to a situation. I would never regret that I went to Nicaragua when I did, knowing as little as I did, documenting what I did. When Julio says they're photographs that are mine, that are part of his collective and other collective consciousness, you can't determine the impact of that. As the fact that by Facebook, actually, I started to get images from the streets in April matching the pictures that I had made 40 years before. So look, some of you are in this room because you probably have to be. Somebody said, it's your class and you're going to have to be here because we want to fill the room. Some of you are stuck with the room, and I hope you've been moved by part of what we've talked about. But the question is where all of your lives will lead you, what you will act upon yourselves, and what field you'll be moved to do so. Hopefully that will happen. This isn't about the path you're going to take necessarily in a specific way, but it's that sense of where can you be, where can you place yourself and be effective and contribute. And so that's the privilege of this kind of education and the exposure. When I go back, and you should know, Steve Glauber is somebody I worked with in Nicaragua for 60 minutes at CBS. How many years ago was that? 40 plus? And the fact that you're here is fantastic and meaningful to me. But the question of history unfolding in ways that we don't predict. The question is, how do you want it to be different? What's the world that we can dream of? You have to still have dreams that are different than the realities. We all know that we're living that today. Maybe we don't all agree about what could be done. Be it in Nicaragua, what it will be, the Nicaraguans are going to hopefully shape their future, not the U.S. government, be it the Trump government or the governments before. How do we as a democratic people protect our own rights? And so I think what's poignant to me, and certainly going back to Nicaragua in June and July and seeing people in the streets, a phenomenal dedication of resistance. You have to care enough about something to take those risks, and all of you know that in different situations. You have to step out, to become part of a collective movement, to pay the consequences. The students that went in front of the UCA didn't think they were going to spend the next, 8 months now in jail under very harsh conditions, whether or not they were tortured or various, the harassment of their families inside their own communities, forced exile. They didn't go on the streets thinking that was their future, right? So I think that, you have to live by the passions you have and believe in something and care enough about it to help transform the world that you want to live in.
Okay, Carol, and then over here, Chris. Carol, go ahead.
I want to thank all of you for the work you're doing to sustain human rights around the world. Thank you so much for sharing this. I'm a historian of photography, so my question goes to you, Susan. And I wanted to ask, you talked about your initial process of sort of moving around, and I think of you as one of the most engaged photojournalists. I had the pleasure to follow your career for many years. Can you talk about your process as a documentarian and photojournalist and what allows you to feel that you're witnessing with honor the experience of the people that you are documenting? And especially given the whole sort of hermeneutics of suspicion that people have around the documentary today.
Yeah, well, it's all changing, So what it might have felt like in '78 being an American, I was challenged as an American. What do you know? Mimi talked about all the bullets in El Salvador. Well, the bullets were first given to the military in Nicaragua, and they were shooting the Nicaraguans, and those bullets might still be from Nicaragua. I don't know if the U.S. is still providing military bullets to the Ortega regime, frankly. I have no idea, right? It was Venezuelan money, but was it also their ammunition? But you know, moving around, I'm actually somebody who follows pretty organically my own sense of process. So I mean, when you all go to the gallery, and I hope you will, you're going to see 40 years of photographs in different points of intervention. The very first work of the insurrection, going back 10 years later, finding people in the photographs, finding out how they felt about the Contra War that Julio just spoke of, how they were demoralized as a result of that war. The U.S. was very effectively, the Contra, supporting that war. The 25-year mark, wondering what the photographs actually mean to people who didn't live through that war. So we do a different kind of film, and you'll see a rendering of that. And then curating the Nicaraguan photographs, some of which you just saw from Julio. So to me, it's not about my photographs, it's about that ongoing witnessing, be they mine, be they what Mercedes said. I mean, Mimi talked about the FaceTime images that are being integrated into situ. It's not about who makes the photograph only, it's what happens to that photograph, how does it contribute beyond the maker to being useful. No? So I think moving around, sometimes I move from continents, you know, across continents. Mimi and I worked together in Kurdistan in the 90s, way long after. In fact, I'm not sure if we met in around Mozote before we met in Kurdistan. In fact, we're not sure. But you know, one moves, you can move, but in fact I was covering the Anfal campaign, which was a genocidal campaign. So the focal point was very similar as a beginning to place myself there. And I think when any of you think about where you place yourself, it doesn't have to be as dramatic and as far away, or as you know, there may be, I think particularly, Tom, when you spoke about why are we here today, because of the border, and because we're all focused on a wall, and what we know is we need bridges, we need different ways of communicating and strengthening cultures that are under this kind of economic and political stress. That's that's causing the flow. So if the funds weren't being made, be it the $5 or the $6 billion to build a wall, what would that money do in these countries to stabilize the conditions? So most people don't want to leave their homes or their graveyards where they buried their grandparents. You know, think about what it would mean, and some of you probably are coming from families that dramatically shifted from where they were. They leave a lot behind. It's a difficult process. It's not necessarily your first choice. But you're a generation that has to make choices too. You know, where do you go back to? Where do you contribute to? I mean, those are, I think, the questions that we hope you're going to be thinking about.
I want to thank you all for your contributions and for your presentations as well. One of the things that I struggle with, specifically with the context of Nicaragua and also Venezuela, is how do we parse through all of the information that exists, no matter what part of the spectrum it comes from. And so I'm wondering if you all could just share with me and share with us, you know, how do you arrive at believing or trusting the sources that you trust, whatever they are?
Maybe I'll start with, I think.
Well, you're an eyewitness. You're living it. Julio's living it.
Yeah. I am an eyewitness, but even so, like when you go talk, it's always useful to have good sources and be able to cite them, right? So for us, the most important people the most important people within all of this have been the human rights defenders, people that were the local ones and then the international ones. People that, essentially, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights thought about who the most credible people possible could be to send in. They chose people like Claudia Paz y Paz, somebody who was behind a trial against the previous dictator in Guatemala, one of those most respected attorneys in Latin America. A whole team that is extremely credible and that had no previous link to either side. And what they did, and what Mercedes is doing as well, is providing all that evidence and making it public, so that people can kind of make up their minds on their own. I'd say that that's the most important thing. Look for the human rights organizations as kind of unbiased as possible. But then, who else can you believe? I mean, it's hard, right? Because kind of innumerable amount of journalists have gone to the country, and normally they end up saying things that are on the same side as the protesters. That the protesters, when they went out, they weren't going out there armed. It wasn't part of a coordinated attack on the government. They were protesting in a kind of disorganized way, which is very different from the government stance. So I'd say, at some point, there will be people that, for political reasons, will never change their minds. But at some point, I think you just have to decide that you will believe the human rights organizations, and you will believe some reporters that you trust. I don't know.
Well, I'm on the side of physical evidence, right? So we try to, that's what we always try to do, to compare the testimonial evidence that you have plenty with the physical evidence and try to see, if it matches, if it doesn't. For example, when we did the site 1 of the Mozote and all those children start, the maintenance of being uncovered, it was like all of a sudden everything that was being said about shootout and about this and that stopped because the evidence itself was so strong. I mean, what were these 136 children, full of bullets on the floor of a little house doing? Right? How can you explain that as a shootout, right? So of course, I think it takes different kinds of analysis, not only physical evidence is one part of it, and as Julio said, I think sometimes we have the best physical evidence and still not be, that. But I think it plays part of a role in this search for truth of what can be established. In the case of Nicaragua, it's the first time that I have to work with so much with videos. It's taken by people, which I found quite amazing. Before it was Susan terms, and there still are, but there's also now all this, thing of like people taking, which I was amazed because of the power of that and how brave people were too, because there were someone on the floor being shot, and immediately around us 20 people with their phones taking that. So what we did with here is something obviously we didn't have before, right? It's like this citizen, journalism or however you want to call it. And within that, try to start cleaning and trying to see what can you use, not use, and so on, together with PA's investigators, and we seem to trying to see time, trying to see what videos matches from different angles, the same scene, and try to reconstruct each scene, working with ballistic guys that analyze sound and see, okay, where that shot that we hear, where is it coming from? Is it from an automatic weapon, a semi-automatic, or, is it hitting this side of the demonstration or the other one? I mean, or what we just recently finished with was also an analysis of these homemade mortars that you see on some of the photographs that, after like a month of repression, the students start getting this. You see them in many of the photographs, these mortars, these homemade mortars, and they make an enormous sound and a lot of smoke. So we did know that it was essentially that, but not much more than that, with these kind of homemade mortars could do. But we asked a physicist to analyze with a ballistic guy the range and the damage that they could do, because we were seeing that the police was walking very calm in front of these mortars, 100 meters away, so they knew the range was not high or anything. So anyway, it came out 60 meters away, and the damage they could produce is really minimal, very hard to even go through clothing when they're a few meters away. So that kind of things may help you, but it's a lot of work on like reconstructing time and space. Right?
Well, no, I was just going to say, Chris, I think that's a really astute question. That's the most difficult one we all face. I mean, and I love hearing Mimi's response. She doesn't start with the assumption she knows the answer. She's looking for what could inform her thinking
in a very, very specific way, even back to the LC on the bullet, comes from Missouri, right? So that's what indicted, and that's what verified the source of the weaponry that was used in the first massacre. The question is, how do we check ourselves? You know, how do we verify what we hear, what we see? Either it's as Julio pointed out, it's a known source, it's somebody, as a journalist you followed for a long time, you trust his compass, as it were. But how do you form that for yourself? And I think that what's been very complicated, it goes back to Steve's question about Nicaragua. Nicaragua in the period of the early, late 70s throughout the 80s, especially during the Contra-War, had a huge solidarity movement, not just in the U.S. There were sister-to-sister town relationships, rebuilding the country, post-Somoza, in that Sandinista period. There was a huge, community throughout Europe, etc., supporting the Sandinistas with great belief that there'd be a third way. This is in the middle of the Cold War, in which it's either the Soviets or it's the U.S. and a country is trying to find a different path for itself. And there were other kinds of players internationally at that time, particularly Mexico and Europe and European partners, who had social democratic values, who believed that it didn't have to be within the construct of the forced construct of the Cold War. So that movement of people, once the Sandinistas were out of power, I think you have to understand what's at work. It's very hard to let go in the same way that Steve asked me of the Ortega of that time. And if I weren't paying attention to what Julio spoke of, is the reduction of and the compression of the checks and balances that had been put in place by the Sandinistas in that period. But in the period after, had been crushed out one by one. If I didn't know people, and I'm speaking honestly, people right from the beginning who had been in the streets, who at the 10-year mark said they no longer believed in what the future was going to be under the Sandinistas because of the restriction of space. If I didn't have those relationships with people for a long time, when I read the news in April, like you, like many of you, had no idea what to make of what I was reading. So my counterbalance, and this is what's difficult in whichever world we're reading about, read about Turkey. Think about all the people in jail in Turkey. Do you know anyone who can tell you, who are those people? Why are they in jail? They signed a petition. Most of them are academics who signed a petition demanding democratic rights, and they are in jail for long, long sentences, maybe life sentences. We don't live in that environment yet in this country. And it's terrifying to think that it could happen here, and you see little signals, and you worry that, in fact, if we don't make the demand. So you have to learn how to educate yourself in these situations, and again, get enough perspectives to counterbalance, because it's very, very hard. I don't want to make it sound easy. In fact, it was a scare for me. I wasn't sure if I should go back. Julio and I know some people in common. I was constantly checking what's going on, what is your opinion of what's going on. And finally, until I was really there and could see what it meant to have an unarmed movement, as massive as I saw in the streets with my own eyes, and yes, I've made the photographs, but it went on and it's gone on, and there have been new stages since I was there. So you have to trust your own eyes and your own ability to counterbalance what you read and find different sources, and not trust anyone. I love that Mimi said that the assumption was one of two things. Either the guerrillas had a shootout with the military and caused the deaths, or the military. She didn't go in assuming she knew the answer. And that's, I think, we all as citizens have to do, and it's very, very difficult, to keep that balance in your mind. If you don't know, how do you find out more? Which is why so many people have stayed. Thank you.
If I may just compliment that, because I think it's a really important question. Often, I think the biggest problem is that people just don't know anything about what's going on in Nicaragua. Some people find out about it. For them, it's enough to hear about the human rights groups. Often, especially people, like Susan said, people that are more on the left and who are more connected to people that knew about Nicaragua in the 80s, have a hard time believing. In that case, other people that can be trusted, I think as I mentioned earlier, since the 90s, all of the intellectual and military leaders of the Sandinista revolution left Ortega. So if you look at who is surrounding him now, essentially you got one guy, who's a big millionaire, and another guy, Pastor, who was actually a Contra for a while. So that's from that period, though, that's who he has left. Everyone else who is a credible Sandinista, who was the intellectual leader of that revolution, is on the other side, and they've written them. And so try to find people that are the symbols of the Sandinista revolution, see where they are, and I guarantee that every single one of them is on the protester side. Carlos Mejia Godoy, who made the music throughout the 70s and 80s, is now making the music for the protests right now. From Costa Rica, from exile. All of his children, his generation that are my age, they're making the new music, the rock music against the dictatorship. So find those people, find those references, and you'll have a better idea of where it stands.
Julio, what you said, talking about the negotiations that started on February 27th, how much of that is directed just against deposing Ortega, seeing him as the problem, almost like he turned into the dictator that they fought against in 1970s. Do you see that as a sort of goal that they have, or do they have something else in place, more of a network of a systematic way to deal with this?
Kind of going in order, and these have been the demands from the very beginning. One is a respect for basic human rights, including the right to protest. So allow people, if you're going to have a peaceful protest in the streets, that you don't get charged on by the police. So demanding freedom of the press, allowing the people that are in the press that are in exile to come back. There are about 70 reporters who can't go into the country right now. Essentially allowing for these basic freedoms as the first step. So that's the first thing that we're asking for pressure for. The second thing has to do with electoral reforms. As we mentioned, we've known for a long time that there is no democracy right now. People can't choose either their local representatives or national ones. So kind of guarantees that there will be the reforms necessary for there to be a transition to democracy in Nicaragua. That is what people are asking for on the streets. And asking for real justice, meaning a real investigation. I mean, the HIE had an important part of April 18th to May 30th. Well, most of the deaths occurred after that. So, and the government keeps saying, no, but the protesters were shooting at us. All right, if you think that's true, let's find out people who are credible internationally and allow them to make those investigations themselves for that entire period. And then we're going to put in jail everyone who pulled the trigger and ask for other people to pull the trigger against students. We're demanding that. Without that, you can't have any real kind of any guarantees that this won't happen in 5 years. And you have to be able to get over it, and you start by the truth, and then for the processes.